people at home can hear, because we can't hear them.
Okay. Okay. So let's get started. This is our the final forum for the first time we're going to talk about this. We're going to continue talking about this throughout the year, but I also want the chance to hear from you later about what spiritual gifts you learned about this summer, or what spiritual gifts you believe you have to offer the community and the world. Because while I was out, you were in here talking about that, and so I don't know about you. Hello, we've met, but I would love to hear more about this summer from you. So we'll finish up the first time we're talking about this Sunday. Next Sunday, if you're interested, we'll have that forum on El Salvador, and then later in the year, we'll start that spiritual gifts forum, and then we'll start to work that forum into this forum, and hopefully it's like chocolate and peanut butter, if you like that. If not, think of another analogy. No, not chocolate and peanut butter. You eat Nutty Bars.
That's not real peanut butter. It's sugar.
Okay, this is a smooth transition into our third session, from what to why, and I'll just quickly recap. I used the 4 questions model for my sabbatical time, and practical theology, practical theological reflection, fancy phrase for theology for living, because that's what theology is for. If you talk about it in here and then you go out and it has no bearing on your life, it's just an intellectual game, and we're not about that here. We're about theology for living. And so the 4 questions: what is going on? Why is this going on? What should be going on? And that's where we pull in our knowledge about God, our faith, our belief. And then what should we do? If you have any questions or need me to clarify, just yell out. Otherwise, I'm just going to go right through this. So my summer focus was on those first 2 questions: what's going on and why is this going on? The third question, what should be going on? I started to approach that, but a lot of that is our ongoing work. Because theology is for living, theology is also for communities of people. And so together, we have a theology of the church. I said last Sunday, we're Lutherans. We don't have a pope. That's kind of our thing. And so we don't have one central group that is deciding what is in bounds and what is out of bounds. And so the way that we work out our theology is together in a community. And so Lutheran churches can look very different depending on where you are, because every community is different. So I did a little bit of this, but we're going to do this together, and then we're going to start to talk about the what should we do. And if you've already heard all this twice, great is your reward in heaven. Okay, the method I used: basic conversations. You don't know unless you ask somebody. Otherwise, I make assumptions, and you know what they say about that, and I do it frequently. Asking for resources. When I first started asking for resources, I was expecting books, studies, previous information that was gathered, and instead, people said, oh, you need a resource. Go talk to David. He's really knowledgeable about this. Or go talk to Bill. He knows a lot about this. Go talk to Margaret. She's been doing this for a long time. And so I ended up with 10 conversation partners who were not who I expected at the beginning, because I went down some paths. My intention is to continue having these conversations on a semi-regular basis, not as intensely as I did during sabbatical, but a chance to continue to stay out in the community and always find out more about what's happening, and always ask why it's happening. And then I reflected on the book of Deuteronomy. Why Deuteronomy? I'm glad you asked. Deuteronomy is an extended commentary and meditation on the 10 Commandments. It is prescriptive and descriptive. I've said this multiple times already, but I'll say it again because I like it. Deuteronomy will include things like there will be no one in need among you, and then in the same paragraph, if there is among you anyone in need. And so it's that combination of God's aspiration for the people. What does God's kingdom look like? And then an acknowledgement that we are not there yet. And so we need God's support. And God gives us that support both through covenant, promise, grace, and through the encouragement to follow, both in Deuteronomy and in the person of Jesus. Okay. So my 10 conversation partners, I'm sure you have all these memorized. So Empire Recovery, Stephen Campbell has done a lot in the community through particularly being a liaison with the county to faith communities, particularly with the car fire and the COVID-19 response. And so he has his fingers in a lot in the community. Children's Legacy Center, Dr. McMullen, who is well known and well regarded for his work serving the homeless. I talked with a gentleman regarding the economic state of the city. I went to Good News Rescue Mission. I talked with Eddie McAllister of Shasta Beloved Community. I talked to some social service organizations such as Northern Valley Catholic Social Service and Pathways to Housing. And then Tim Danielson, who was here for as part of Salvation Army, helped to lead the community recovery team through the car fire response, very active in the community, is now part of United Way and is in fact helping to coordinate the micro shelter community that already exists on South Market. Okay. Is this enough of a fire hose? Yeah, Gus.
Well, in the past sessions, you've talked about talking to these different organizations and asking where the needs were.
Yes.
And the fact that a lot of times, even though there have been grants or things available, but nobody knows how to get them and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Did you ever go to like the top and ask the administrators, hey, how come they're having a problem? Or what do you see as a problem?
I had on my schedule Steve Bade. And I will. Steve Bade is the assistant city manager. Assistant?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And so I have on my schedule to see him. He was on my list, but he got bumped down when you might be able to see there are some places where there was a connection between one person I saw and the next person I saw. I talked to Stephen Campbell and he said, well, why don't you talk to my buddy Marty? I know Marty really well, and he's got his finger on redevelopment and the economics of the city. So I went to see Marty, and he said, did you know my wife works for Good News Rescue Mission? And so as other people got slotted in, some people are, Steve is on my list of people to talk to. I was deliberately avoiding people who have, shall I say, elected positions, because people who have elected positions are a little less likely to be involved in as many nuts and bolts as like the city manager would be, just by the nature of their position. The city manager's office is much more on the ground. And so that was where I want to be. But yes, he's on my list. Thank you for bringing that up, Gus.
Well, I'm even thinking about the elected officials. Do they see the same problem that the people that you talk to see as a problem? That's what I'm wondering. You know, I'm like, would you go to the city? Would you go to the county administrators, and would you say, is there a problem with this? And they'd say, no, we've got this covered or something. I'm just wondering if there was a different viewpoint.
That's an excellent question.
I think Gus has a really good point about, talking to elected officials, because I think it would be interesting to know what they say and how it differs from or is similar to what the people who are doing the work say. Because I have a perception that a politician is going to create their message to match what people want to hear so that they can get elected, and not necessarily describe what's really going on.
Mhm.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But part of their job, part of the way that they got elected was by looking around and saying, I think that this is what's going on,
And I'll fix it.
and I'm going to fix it by doing this. They kind of skip the why is it going on and what should be going on. In a way, they kind of breeze through those quickly. I think most of the time, maybe not. I could be wrong. But these 4 questions are actually part of the development of a political campaign and a platform. So those people actually will be able to answer those questions for you, and it would be interesting for you to compare what they say versus what other types of people are saying, just to see, because I think politicians have, in the same way that these people have a pulse on what's really happening in the community, politicians have a pulse on perception, public perception, because they have to say, they're supposed to say, what I agree with that. I'm going to vote for you, right?
Mm-hmm.
I agree with your assessment of the problem and how you're going to fix it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's an important, helpful piece to it, because why things are happening often has to do with the difference between the public's perception and the reality. So I think that would help a lot.
Okay.
With your
Challenge accepted,
Yeah.
Gus.
We can do it tomorrow or when?
Well, I owe the vice mayor a call tomorrow, actually, so I can get started this week. Okay, the questions I asked, the one that is really part of our discussion today is, why do these needs exist? The needs that they believe they're addressing, and that does start to feed into other questions of, what are strengths in this community? What are impediments to this work in our community? Are there already programs and resources that are available? Are things missing? Are things in need of improvement? And then the last question I always ask people is, if you had unlimited resources, what would you have people do? So we'll focus on the why today. This isn't the only time, again. So what we talked about last week, I'm just going to quickly move through these. Not enough beds to support the county's homeless population. Generally speaking, the atmosphere in our community is such that people do not treat each other with compassion, dignity, and respect. There is as a community, we are often failing to provide a positive vision of who people can be, one that lines up with their resources and their abilities, what Steve Campbell called their full humanity. The cost of living is unsustainable for many people. If you live on a disability check, there are 0 places in the county in which you can live. Local government upheaval is hindering the ability to meet needs, and that's not necessarily a political statement. That is a statement of how our county is currently staffed, who I would call the civil servants of the county.
Can you go back for a second? Just to the one in the middle,
The cost of living.
because you kind of breezed past that.
Sorry,
and
I
you-
breezed
you
through
didn't
that.
fully explain.
Oh, okay.
So if you are living on a disability
If
check,
you live on a disability check and you have no other income, no other way to support yourself.
so you said there is nowhere for you to live, but what you meant was there is no affordable place for you to access.
There is no affordable place for you to access. Yes, thank you. It's like Groucho Marx said about New York City. On $10 a week, you can live like a king. You won't be able to eat, but you can live like a king. So what's going on? There is generational trauma in our community that is passed down from parents to children. And so the way I put it last week was none of us are blank slates. We have been scribbled on for generations before we even came along. And so that trauma manifests itself in different ways in the community. And in many ways, there's a lack of understanding or disagreement over even what's going on. And that feeds into what you mentioned, Gus, and what you got to, Katie, about what the perception is in our area. Because part of this went to, homelessness has never been a bigger problem. Homelessness hasn't been so well addressed in the last 30 years. Our community doesn't have the resources to approach this problem. Well, we do have the resources, but there's no communication between organizations. So there were conflicting messages coming from people depending on where they were located within the larger community. We have I don't know if you call it an organization, a gathering called the Continuum of Care, which has a number of social service organizations. And when I spoke to somebody within that organization, she said, well, we have great communication with all of the organizations. We know exactly what's going on in this county. And then I talked to somebody who is not part of the Continuum of Care, and they said, nobody has ever contacted us about our work and where we might fit in a larger puzzle. And so a lot of it is, what you think is going on depends on where you're standing. And people are standing in a lot of different places. Anything on this before I go on? All right. So why is this going on? So this interpretive level of why is a little messier because the relationship between cause and effect can be murky. It's not always this is happening because this. Sometimes cause and effect are blurred. Sometimes a what that we talked about can be a why, or vice versa. So this is what we talked about last week. We'll just breeze through it again. Community is becoming atomized. And when I say atomized, I mean broken down into smaller parts. So that is part of a breakdown of connections between individuals. And we say an epidemic of loneliness because I spoke with a local pastor and she said, the number of people in my church who go to church on Sunday and go home and hardly see anybody during the week is staggering. That there are very few places to have meaningful connections that don't already exist for shall we say, a tribe of people, which I'll address in a moment. Part of that is the rootlessness of modern life. The last church I was at, the one family that came in was the 6th generation family from that church. They had been there from the founding, and they told me the first day that I could say whatever damn fool thing I wanted to say in the church, but they were not going to make them leave their church. This is not your church, pastor. This is my church. And I said, you're exactly right. But the rootlessness of modern life means that for that particular family, it's a very open question of whether that 7th generation is going to be attending that church. Because people are no longer rooted in one area, even in one area for very long. Before Katie and I moved into our house here, I lived in, an average of 6 months per dwelling from the time I graduated college. And so I was all over the place. Not necessarily in different areas, not necessarily in different areas of the country, but there is a sort of rootlessness, particularly for younger generations. And that does not, shall we say, encourage long-term community. A decrease in concern for those unlike us. And I said in concern, and we talked about this last week. I think that we could say in empathy for those unlike us, a decrease in being willing to understand the situation of somebody unlike us. And some of that comes back to the fact that we are not blank slates. I never encounter Pete in the abstract. I always encounter Pete as a person who has, Pete has experienced his life in his way. And so I can't just say, hello, fellow white man. It's good to see you today. How are you doing? Because Pete is much more than that. But very often we say, well, that person isn't like us, and we choose some attribute, some reason for them to be unlike us. And there's a decrease in empathy, a willingness to connect across that barrier once we have created the barrier. Did I say that better than last week? I'm asking my wife because she was keeping score. Okay.
Ouch.
Okay, another thing. No, not ouch. You keep me honest. I like that. You all keep me honest. I like that. Again, atomization. What I saw in the New York Times, they called it the extremism of freedom, which is to say the reduction of the idea of freedom just to the complete removal of constraints. Not only, I have the freedom to say what I want, but I should also have the freedom to avoid judgment or response to what I've had to say. I should be able to say or do what I like without concern for other people. And so freedom becomes very heavily individualized. And that is, in that extreme sense, that becomes corrosive to community, because community requires that I release a little bit of myself for the sake of the whole community. Okay, partisan politics before people, which is to say that we think about issues. Here's an issue. Are you for it? Are you against it? What do you think of it? Instead of saying, here's Steve. Steve is somebody who is actually affected by this issue. Now, Steve, he's a nice guy. You've known his mom for a long time. All of a sudden, it stops being a political football. Do you agree with this? Are you for it or are you against it? And it becomes facing somebody who is part of your community or could be part of your community. And that's a very different thing. Very often the inclination is to stick to this first part. And so we don't even get to people because we're so busy staking out our territory. A lack of genuine public spaces where we encounter people who are unlike us for the purpose of conversation and not for conflict. And so I mentioned this last week. If you go to the County Board of Supervisors, you hear people who are encountering people unlike themselves. But it's not usually for the purpose of mutual conversation and uplift. It is for the purpose of saying what you want to say and defeating your opponent, whether that opponent is in the room or that opponent is a certain idea or what have you. That polarization is fed by silos, which is to say that my phone, for example, when I open up the news app, it shows me exactly what I want to see based on what I have looked at in the past. And so my phone gives me a completely different view of the world than your phone might, depending on what I have chosen to see. And it thinks it's helping, but it is feeding into those silos. Depending on where you choose to get your news, you may have a completely different view of the world than somebody else. The disintegration of loyal opposition, which is to say, we no longer think the best of people who do not share our affiliation. It is not that the opposing group is misguided or does not have the best way to approach the situation. It's that they are trying to destroy your country. They're trying to take it away from you. And the only way to stop that is to destroy them, whether politically or otherwise. And that feeds into the outrage machine and echo chambers, which is to say, where you get your news. Try watching the news one night on a completely different channel. It's fascinating. Okay, so now we're into the new stuff. So one thing that we talked about, I particularly talked about with Marty Mosley, is money matters. I promise this isn't supposed to be Money Sunday. I preached a stewardship sermon because that was what was in Deuteronomy. But I promise this wasn't intentional. Money matters. Inflation. Inflation is not only a why, it's also a what. It's part of what's going on. It starts a cycle, which leads to the perception of economic scarcity, because there are different ways we can live our lives regarding money, especially in times when inflation is happening. We have the inclination to say, I need to make sure I'm taking care of myself, which makes sense. Household budgets must be balanced. But then we hold on really tightly to that idea of scarcity. I don't know if I have enough. I don't know if I have enough for X, Y, or Z. And I am not making a judgment on that. I am just saying that that drives some of the other things that I saw. And the idea of this is something I heard from one of my interviewees. Money isn't getting where it needs to be. And that can refer to, it refers to the county and the city. It also refers to people making direct donations. Because in times where there is a feeling of widespread scarcity, then we are more likely to hold off on making those gifts. We are more likely to say, well, once I feel more settled, I can do that. And so that becomes a what and why that moves around in a vicious circle, vicious cycle. I never remember what the phrase is. You know what I mean. Any questions about this? I don't mean for this to be an economic forum, because I am not the person to talk to about economics.
I think this though is, I mean, it's using different words, but this is the same slide as loneliness, isolation, community, rootlessness. And the reason I say that is because if it's all about me and my needs and my security, then inflation means that I stop spending my money when I don't have to. And therefore, the people who own the business that I used to spend my money at isn't getting that money anymore. And therefore, they can't pay their employee to do the job. And so they have to fire that person. And now that person's lost their job. And if they can't find another job, because everybody's going through that, then they end up living on the street because they lose their house. And so ultimately, the fact that I am choosing to turn inward and stop spending money in the way that I used to is why that person is on the street in a small way. It's because I think it's about me. And it's not about the community. And I'm not saying that we should all just go out and, start buying stuff willy-nilly. That's not the solution. But I think that, when we think about economics, we have to think about economics within a community setting. Money isn't getting where it needs to be. Money isn't getting into the hands of the people who need it, not just through giving and donations and charities, but we wouldn't need those charities if those people had a job that could sustain them. And the inflation that we're experiencing is exacerbating that, if not causing it.
That's a very good point. All right. And in case you were curious, I do intend to talk with Marty Mosley at least one more time about the economics of our city, because he was very insightful, especially with this discussion, which I am trying to replicate very crudely. Another, why is this going on? I think this is a really important one. The end of empathy. Who should we have empathy for and under what circumstances? That we reserve our empathy for people who are like us, or for people we know, people within our circle. Whereas people outside our circle, we are less likely to be charitable to. I think about how when I am driving and I break the speed limit, Reading Police Department, don't watch this video. When I break the speed limit and I speed past somebody, I have an important place I have to be. And so I need to get there soon. I might be running late. There might be some other situation I need to address early, but I have a very good reason for why I'm driving so fast. When somebody else blows past me on the road, they're an inconsiderate jerk who has no idea, driving like a maniac down the road. There is that, I am willing to give grace to myself or people that I know, and I am less likely to give grace to people who I do not know. Driving is a particularly good example because you usually don't see people's faces while you're driving, so they are not. You can pretend they're not people.
Pastor?
Yeah.
I think sometimes, I don't know if it's really the end of empathy or that there's so much demand and so much diversity to have empathy. It's easier to not do it because they're, bombards you from so many different places that it requires energy, emotional energy to have empathy.
Right.
And so because there's so much demand for empathy or understanding to have the empathy, sometimes it's hard to put that energy. And so the end, maybe the end is, it's not necessarily so much the end of it as it is the direction of it is so diverse that it's hard to have empathy.
Maybe the end of empathy, not in the sense of the termination of empathy, but the goal of empathy. What's the goal? What's the end to which we strive?
Okay.
When we show, no, I just thought of that now when you said that.
Yeah, because to me, when you said the end of empathy means I'm not going to have any at all, and it might just be there's such a demand. Is it for Israel? Is it for Gaza? Is it for our unsheltered people that are locally?
It's overwhelming.
It becomes overwhelming,
like
and so
overwhelming.
where do we do the
Where do
empathy?
I start?
Yeah,
So I don't know if end is the right verb to have it.
well, that's the, I mean, you're spot on, because it is a, one thing I didn't include that now I realize is that while we live in a world that is more atomized, we also paradoxically live in a world that is much larger, because we do have a greater awareness of the wider world. At my first call, there was a gentleman who lived on his family farm. He was 70 years old, and he prided himself that he'd never gone to the city. And for 2 years, I thought he meant Harrisburg, which is the state capital and fairly large. He meant Duncannon, which is a town of about 2,000 people. He had never been there. He grew up and spent his entire life within 10 miles of that farm. And that was the way that was the way he wanted to spend his life, and he was older, and so this was simply the way that the rhythms of life were. he may be the last person in modern American society to not have some sort of experience with the wider world. I'm not saying that that was wrong. That was simply the way that life was for his family for generations. But that awareness that the world is much bigger, if it were not for communications, we would not be aware of many things that are happening, even many things that are not happening in our state capital, let alone the nation's capital, let alone halfway around the world. And so that, whether we like it or not, we have that greater awareness. And so you're absolutely right, Margaret, Kevin. You know, how do we spend the energy we have? We don't have unlimited energy. And this is a great question of, you know, Christian ethics, which we can dig down into. We don't have, you know, only God has infinite love. So how do we order our love? How do we figure out in the world where we offer that love? I think you're absolutely right.
Well, and you hear these arguments often. Well, I don't want to, I have $10 to give that I don't need. Should I give it to the Ukraine or should I give it to the homeless in Reading?
Hmm.
You know, who takes priority? And you have a lot of people, and I'm not saying I'm not one of them, maybe I am, who says, well, wait a minute, why are we giving so much to these other countries when our country needs so much? You know, we've got homeless right here. Why should I be worrying about people living in Israel?
And that's, I mean, saying, you know, I have this money. Who do I offer it to? That's a prime example. And that goes along with, you know, I would say as a church community and figuring out what we believe together also affects our idea of, you know, where do we spend our collective energy? So it happens on an individual and on a church level, because you can't give to every place you want to give. I can't give to every place I want to give. Katie has to hide the letters that come in from groups asking for donations, because I'll just stack them up and I'll send them out. So she has to hide them and say, we need to be deliberate about what we're doing. And that feeds into this. Anything else about this? Okay. I chose this quote from Martin Luther, from the Small Catechism. I shouldn't say I chose this quote, because Luther says we should consider our neighbors in the best possible light, which is to say, this goes along with, I believe it's the commandment about stealing. Or no, it's the commandment about, oh, this is embarrassing.
Murder?
I'm a pastor, I should know this.
Is it
You shall
murder?
not covet your neighbor's.
Yeah, I think, yeah.
I want to say.
It's one of
I want to
them.
say it's murder, actually.
A bonus next week for the person who figures out which one it is. But, you know, we no longer consider our neighbors in the best possible light, because that's something that Luther says for us. You know, it's murder. Because Luther also says, if there is somebody in need and we do not help them, we are as complicit in their murder as the active component. And so Luther says, therefore, we should protect our neighbor, including their reputation. We should speak well of them. We should consider everything they do in the best possible light. And we no longer consider our neighbors in the best possible light. Like I said, the guy who was speeding past me, that inconsiderate jerk, maybe he was driving to the hospital. I should, instead of saying, that jerk, I should have said, I hope that he gets where he needs to go safely. Is that actually the case? I don't know. but I should consider in the best possible light. Any thoughts about that? I know that's a
Define our
really tough.
neighbor should be any human being.
Yes, yes. Who is my neighbor? That's the question that the young man put to Jesus. But who is my neighbor? And really, when he said, "Who is my neighbor?" he said, "Who is not my neighbor?" He wants permission to not treat somebody or a group of somebodies well. He wants permission to not love them. And so when Jesus tells that story of the Good Samaritan, he holds up, the question is not necessarily, and here I'm going to play with what you said. I think it's in the same spirit. Jesus turns the question from who is my neighbor into who is his neighbor. Here's somebody who needs something. Who's going to be a neighbor for him? Who's going to be a neighbor for her? And I think that's saying the same thing that Luther does and that you just did. Anything else on this one? All right. Yeah.
I was looking for this because I couldn't remember what it was. What you've been talking about is called fundamental attribution error. There's a name for this.
Fundamental attribution
Yes.
error. Okay, put that in your pocket.
I wanted to bring this up because I think it's important. Because it's what fundamental attribution error is observers tend to over-attribute the behaviors of others to their personality. For example, he is late because he's selfish, and under-attribute them to the situation or context, i.e., he is late because he got stuck in traffic. Whereas for yourself, it's the opposite. You never attribute your failings to personality, you attribute them to situation. Fundamental attribution error. And I think that's important because this is who we are fundamentally. There's not really change to this because this is psychology. This is human nature but it's harder to allow yourself to fall into human nature when you know the people that you're like. If that person that blows by you is Linda, you're going to be like, oh, that person's a maniac. Oh, that was Linda.
I'm going to say,
Ooh.
I can't
I
wait to
wonder
call
what's-
her and say,
yeah.
I caught you.
I wonder what's going on. Then all of a sudden you put them into the category of, person, right?
Yeah.
But I think that's important because it's not just things are changing and things are getting worse. It's because we don't have community, because we don't know each other, because we are drawing back, because we are rootless, because we don't know everybody that we run into all the time. It's easier for us to just allow our human nature, our psychology to take over more and more often.
I'm glad that you mentioned that because that feeds into something that I always struggle with because sometimes when I react and I don't respond, I just immediately react, and then later I look back and say I should have done this or that. That some of that reaction is baked into my life experiences, and if you've ever reacted and not responded, that doesn't necessarily make for a moral failing on your part. I've been told that when you react to something, you react in the way that you've been conditioned to react. But what you do second is what you have learned about how to respond. And so your immediate reaction doesn't define you as a person. It is part of how we're wired as human beings. It's the second thing. It's when we check ourselves and say, well, maybe this, that reflects our own growth and our own learning. I think that's really important because we live in a world that wants your reaction and doesn't want your response, or wants your response less and later and for certain people. Okay. Another reason, or another why of what's going on, why is this going on? A need for education, which is to say, I learned a lot about the nexus of homelessness, substance use disorder, mental health, and generational trauma. Those things are deeply, in some ways, inextricably linked, and they are often linked in ways that we don't wish to acknowledge. Not we, but we. I've heard a lot from people, not the people I interviewed, that homelessness happens because of substance use disorders. That homelessness can happen because of mental health issues, when it's much more likely that it happens the other way. That somebody becomes homeless, is no longer able to get their medicine, self-medicates in ways that are not helpful, and that spiral continues. That homelessness is often a why in places where we think it's a what. Questions about this?
I'm afraid to ask this question because
No.
everybody probably knows the answer. But
No.
what is generational trauma? What does that mean?
Oh, you've taken the ACEs class, Katie. You tell everybody. You know, hey, you just had that foundational, I've already forgotten it.
I didn't have that one on the tip of my tongue, though. I had to look it up.
Yeah.
So there are several things going on with generational trauma. One of them is that, and I can't remember the name of the doctor, but there's this doctor who did some research and kind of started to understand that there are markers, there are emotional, psychological, social markers for your physical and emotional and mental health as you age. So when you're a child, you experience certain things. And when you experience these things, you are more likely as an adult to have even physical problems. Like you're more likely to have a heart attack, you're more likely to have a stroke, you're more likely to have high blood pressure, all of these different things. Because when you were a child, and some of the things are someone in your family was incarcerated, your parents are divorced, there was domestic violence in your home, there was someone who had a substance use disorder in your home. Things like that. And so ACEs is a quiz that you can take, and everybody here, you could go online right now and take it. And it never, once you hit 18, it never changes because they're factual things. They're not, oh, well, I can perceive this way. They're facts. And your ACE score tells you how likely it is that your physical health, your emotional health, your mental health are going to be affected even as an adult. And as they've done more research on this, they have actually discovered that it doesn't even matter if the thing happens to you. It matters if someone in your generational line experienced it. This was what blew my mind. They've done research with the descendants of Holocaust survivors. So these are not people who experienced the Holocaust. They're like my age. They weren't even alive at that time. They're, the grandchildren or great-grandchildren of these people who went through this major trauma. And they discovered that there is actually traceable evidence in the DNA of these people that this trauma comes through the generations. And when they told me that in this class, the first place that my brain went was where in the Bible it talks about the sins of the parents following for 3 or 4 generations of those who hate me and do bad things, but my blessings following those for 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. I think that is not, I don't think that is a theological statement about what God does. that God isn't following people and punishing their children for something they did. I think that is a description of what is happening biologically to us. That when we go through traumatic, like severely traumatic events, not only does that experience affect how we raise our children and interact with our friends and, create our family, but there's also a biological, a DNA shift that then follows for generations. So even the great grandchildren of these Holocaust survivors who never met this person that they are related to, who don't even necessarily know about them, they are affected by this because the traumas that happen to us affect us so much that it's not just our brains, it's our bodies, it's our souls, it's our communities that are affected by trauma. And so we talk about generational trauma, not just in terms of, well, if I was abused and I don't deal with that, then I'm going to abuse my kid. We talk about it in so many bigger ways. So there you go. That's my,
Thank you.
in a nutshell.
And that speaks to when I talked with Art Sevilla at Empire Recovery Center, he talked about how he is now 18 years sober, a monumental achievement. But he talks about how, looking back, before he was sober, he hurt people he cared about deeply. And he said, they are going to bear those scars, and I can work to try to bring healing. But in some places, those wounds may not heal, and they may carry those wounds on, and they may, who knows who they affect, who knows, how that will continue generationally. But then he pointed out the flip side, what I would say the 1,000 generations that he is in a place where he can positively impact people, and he'll never know how those ripple. He'll never know how, modeling a healthful life will affect those that he works with and those he loves, and how those will carry on. But this, I ask you because the best way I can think of generational trauma is like rippling, like throwing a stone in a pond, and you don't just throw it in and bloop, but it spreads out. And so the ways in which it spreads out, we may not even be aware of where it reaches us. Some of those Holocaust survivors' great-grandchildren may not be able to articulate those things, but they're there. And so that feeds into the blank, I'm not a blank slate and you're not a blank slate when we encounter each other. Anything else on this one? There's less conversation this week. Did I do a bad job? Yeah, Rob?
Because I taught for many years, children who came from homes that were physically abusive, because I taught for so long and taught generationally, often those kids would turn into abusers of some sort, or they would marry someone who would abuse them. It wasn't okay, if you do this or this happened to you, this will happen.
Mm-hmm.
But because it was modeled, they didn't really know how to do different.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You say that again.
Yeah. The Robin mentioned just now, I'm talking to the camera. Robin mentioned how as a teacher, she could see how generationally having taught students who became parents and then seeing children, how growing up in an abusive household would then lead to children taking on the same traits because it was what they knew. And so there was not an opportunity to break that cycle. Did I say that correctly?
Yeah, if they knew better, they would do better. And some of them did because they realized they had to break the cycle.
Yeah, if they knew better, they would do better. I like that. Thank you. Yeah, Gus.
Back in my college days,
Okay.
I remember taking psychology of development of children. And I remember being told more than once, by the time a child is 4 years old, they develop their personality. And it'd be unlikely to change unless there's some traumatic event. Now, there was a traumatic event in my life when Kennedy was shot. There were traumatic events in a lot of people's lives when that spaceship blew up.
Mm.
But those kind of events can change your personality. But otherwise, by the time you're 4 years old, you pretty much developed your personality.
Your personality is formed by 4 years old.
I had a question, generational trauma.
Mhm.
Suppose something happened in the past, like a generation before you,
Mhm.
but you are unaware of it due to the don't talk, don't tell attitude that some of our parents or grandparents have. We don't discuss that, we're not. Does that still impact you, even though you are unaware of what happened?
Yeah, I think so. Katie's nodding her head, and she knows more about ACEs than I do. Yeah, David.
I think it's a great question, Joan. If we flesh that out further, let's say there's some sort of abuse that happens 2 generations from you and I, that no one talks about, and no one goes and gets help for in that regard. Imagine then playing out the limping that goes on emotionally, psychologically, spiritually for that person or that group of people that aren't able to talk about those things. So the limping then becomes normal for that person in that situation or that group of people, as opposed to had they talked about it, had they got things worked out, had a much more healthy response. You and I and our parents, right, that generation after this initial trauma has taken place, are going to realize that those sort of things just are normal, right? We're not going to question why mom or dad acts this way, they just act this way. As opposed to if they had talked about it, had some openness of it, had some healing about it, there would be a different situation. So I think of your situation, or your question, the importance of being upfront, the importance of having sort of that vulnerability that sometimes is really difficult, but ultimately healthier in the long run.
Thank you, David.
Yeah.
All right. Anything else? I realize I'm starting to encroach on lunchtime. Why is this going on? There are barriers to resources or treatments. I think of the example that Art Sevilla gave me, that if you are deep in substance use disorder and you realize in the middle of the night at 3 a.m., you have what they call a moment of clarity, and you realize that you need help. Where can you go for help in the city of Reading at 3 in the morning? We don't have anywhere. What happens if it's at 11 in the morning? I can go to Empire. I'm not picking on Empire. I can go to a substance use disorder recovery center, and they might say, well, we'll give you an appointment. Come back in 3 days at 9 a.m. What is the likelihood that I will have the resources and the knowledge to make it back there at that time for that scheduled appointment? Depending on my resources. If I don't have a car, I'm going to have to rely on public transport. And so I'm going to have to know the bus schedule. If this is my moment of clarity, who's to say that that clarity will still be there in 3 days? So sometimes we have barriers to resources in this community, resources that exist, but there is a distance between people and those resources. I like to think, I'm not the world's smartest guy, but generally speaking, I can get around in my daily life. If I didn't have a car and I showed up and they said, come back in 3 days at 9 a.m., I don't stand much of a chance, just because, you know me, I can't even start service at 9 a.m. What's the chances that I'm gonna make it to the bus stop? And if I miss that, and I miss that appointment, well, then the next time I go there, they're just gonna tell me to set another appointment. And so there are things that, there are treatments and resources available, but they presume a certain number of resources we already possess that people may not possess. And that becomes a barrier. And then part of that, I mentioned this earlier, this was a what, it's also a why. A lack of communication or coordination between agencies, that often we are not really aware of what's going on outside of our particular agency, which, I mean, the agencies are doing great things. But I think of the example of my internship church, our friend Carol. I love Carol. Carol is like my sister, but for Carol, if a church was doing anything at their church, our church should be doing it too. Did you know that the Episcopal Church has a food bank? Why don't we have a food bank? Because the Episcopal Church is 2 roads down. Why don't we just give to their food bank? Otherwise, there'd be 2 food banks that each don't have very much food. So maybe we coordinate and pool our resources. But sometimes that can be difficult. And that also feeds into the why of, our desire sometimes to have control and so on and so forth. But I offer that to you as a why that could perhaps be dug down even deeper. Anything about these two? Yeah, Lena.
So I work in probation, and that's a common problem with a lot of people that we help, is that they're homeless and they're not able to get to these appointments, or they just don't remember to go, or they're, struggling with substance abuse, and so it's not the first thing on their mind. And so often in that situation, officers will go out and pick them up at wherever they are and bring them to those resources. So that's a nice thing that they can do, but I do think about how it's sad that someone has to get in trouble first with the law before they're eligible for those resources.
Yeah, you're absolutely right that the way our system is currently constructed, people have to get in trouble before they even gain access. And that can be heartbreaking. Absolutely heartbreaking. Thank you for that, Lena. Yeah, Robin.
There is very little help in Shasta County for mental health services. I think many of you know that our middle child is schizophrenic. And when this first started, I had no idea about any of this. I called the sheriff's office twice for help. And they told me I'm on my own, especially when they found out I lived in Happy Valley. Finally, when I was in the middle of cancer treatment, I didn't know what to do, so I had Fred take us to Shasta County Mental Health. And I didn't mean to cry, but I was sobbing by the time I got in there. They listened to me. They said, do you think your son would allow you to talk to us? I said, yes. As it turned out, he won't. I explained the situation, made an appointment for him, made sure he got there. A very long story short, he is under mental health care now. He has medication, he doesn't always take it. Things are not always wonderful, but it's been a long haul. And if anyone here needs someone to talk to, I can help you find some resources and tell you the story. But it's it's a sad thing. I don't know what we need to do to get more help, but if it weren't for us, our son, I know, would be on the streets, homeless, and probably not living. He hears voices. He responds to them. Usually his response is, get out of here, and all kinds of filthy language, or I'm going to kill you. And I'm sure if someone heard that, they probably would have killed him. It still goes on. He's staying with us right now because he's having transportation trouble, and as soon as he's back with transportation, we will take him back to his house. But it's difficult. But like I said, if someone needs to talk, I can help you with what I know. I can't help you, but I can help you with what I know.
I know mental health is a big problem because the only mental health my husband got was a 5150. And for those of you that don't know what a 5150 is, the police are there, they arrest them, and they have to hold them for 72 hours. At the end of 72 hours, you're back in the same situation with nothing.
Mhm.
So we went to Chico, we're supposed to be in place, and all they did was, you need to get a hold of a psychiatrist. There was no, here's an appointment, this is who you need to see, this is where you need to go. It's, the ball's in your court, as it was in yours. It's up to you to figure this out.
I appreciate that you both shared those stories. I think when I heard that, and when I heard you speak, Lena, it made me think of another. This isn't necessarily. I'm trying to process whether or not this is a what or a why, but I'm going to say it. What I've heard in these stories is that because there are lack of other resources, we ask our law enforcement to do things that they should not be
They have no
asked to do.
training. They have no training. They don't know
Yes.
what to do. I wouldn't know what to do.
In my situation, the police need to be there.
Mhm.
There were
Okay.
guns involved.
Yeah.
And
And
so
that
they
is-
needed to be there.
They absolutely needed to be there.
But the
it's-
lack of follow-up
Mhm.
of where to go and what to do and who helps you.
Yeah.
There was none.
Mhm.
It happens in emergency rooms not infrequently when they have to call a 5150 because somebody is violent or they think they're going to be violent, and the police show up. But like you said, do they have training on what to do with somebody who is not acting the way you think they ought to act?
Mhm.
They're not in their right mind. Their mind is elsewhere and they're in a different world and not in the world you're in. And
Yeah.
I was even told by the officer, don't come to the hospital.
We do have one newer resource in Shasta County now that was not available at this time. It's called the Hope Van. I don't have my wallet with me, it's my office, but in my wallet I have the Hope Van card. I could try to get some and have them available for people, but if you see someone in need of mental health emergency, crisis intervention, you are supposed to call the Hope Van instead of calling the police. They have people who are trained to intervene in a mental health crisis. But again, it's one group for 200,000 people across the entire county. And so it depends on where you are and what time it is. And, do they have people on staff right now? And are they already helping somebody out right now or not? And those types of things. So there are small ways that these things happen. And actually, I wasn't going to bring this up, but when you talked about, this and we were hearing these examples, something that I have found incredibly powerful is exercises where you are given a situation that you could potentially be in, and you can't mimic, you can't imitate the struggles of that situation, because if we sat, like, say the four of us sitting at this table were given a scenario. We are a family. We've got our pregnant teenager who needs help with her pregnancy, and we've got the mental health or the alcoholic father, or, whatever, these different things are happening. You can't then say, okay, well, now you have to act like an alcoholic and, you don't have your resources. That we already have the benefit of education and knowledge and resources and people that we can call. But if you do the best you can to pretend like that isn't there, and then you say, okay, here's your situation, here's $10, you have no car, we leave you downtown, you have to figure it out. I've done that several times, including here in Reading, and it is incredibly difficult, even for people who are well-educated, who don't spend all their time on the street, who don't have substance use disorders, those types of things. You have to figure it out. You have to navigate. You have to just start looking around, walk downtown and see what you can find. My group, the last time I did it here in Reading, my group had a pregnant teenager. And so we were walking down Market Street. And at that time, the Shasta County Office for, I forget what it was called, like pregnancy and young children or something like that, was right there near the Atrium Mall. And so we just saw this place and we went in and we said, hey, we're doing this exercise. Here's our pretend pregnant teenager. What resources might you have for us? And they gave us some pamphlets and they said, if it was real, we would bring you back. Is it today or is it another day? Well, it's usually another day because our case managers are always with somebody or not here, that blah, blah, blah. And then from there, they said, oh, you don't have a job, go down to the Smart Center. So then from there, people sort of know these things, but there's no coordination. There's no official place that everybody can go. You can call 211, which is a great resource in our community, but a lot of people don't know about 211. And so again, you have to find the right person who's going to direct you to the right resource in that particular moment. And that's how I know about a lot of this stuff, is just because of all the different things that I've gotten involved in and trying these exercises and things like that. But the average person on the street doesn't know this stuff, So when you get into these situations, you have no idea what to do.
All right. We have about 10 minutes before I must release you out into the wild. Part of why is this going on? A focus on symptoms and not sources or causes. And I think about this particularly in terms of homelessness, because we do have some resources. We have, the Good News Rescue Mission. I'm not going to pick on them because they do wonderful work. One of the requirements they have is if you want a bed, you have to be clean. And it is very difficult to ask somebody who is out in the, out living homeless, who has a substance use disorder, to kick that before they can get to a safe place to sleep. And so we often focus on the symptom. We see people who are homeless and we want to address that, but we don't address the cause that underlies the current situation. And I think of this, Brazilian Catholic Archbishop Helder Camara once said, when I give food to the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why they're poor, they call me a communist. Because he wanted to address not only people should have food, and that's important, and he fed them, but then he wanted them to be in a situation where they didn't need to go and rely on somebody else to get food. And for some people, that is a threat to the system as it currently exists. And so they called him a communist. Sometimes it is as simple as a fear of change. Yeah, David.
Can I ask one question about the rescue mission?
Mm-hmm.
You have said earlier that there's roughly 2,000 homeless in Reading.
Mm-hmm.
And how many beds does Good News offer?
300.
300. And they are still full every night, roughly, with those 300 folks that are willing to be clean.
Mm-hmm.
How many more beds would they need? Do you know how many beds they would need of people that are willing to be clean and don't have room at Good News Shelter, at Good News Rescue Mission.
I don't know.
And then it makes me wonder how many have that substance abuse problem and just don't have the ability to get clean.
Exactly.
What's that? What are those numbers in there?
Mhm. Because that ties back into mental health issues, because often substance use disorder can be a way that I try to self-medicate
Yeah.
when I don't have the option of getting the medicine that I need. And so that feeds right back into that nexus. It's hard to pull one thing out and address it without addressing the other pieces around it. Yeah, thank you.
There is a really great book called Homelessness is a Housing Problem. And the reason I highlight that right now is because it talks about the difference between East Coast homelessness and West Coast homelessness. On the East Coast, there is a bed for every homeless person on any given night. There has to be, because it's cold there, because the weather is terrible there. And so the way that they have dealt with homelessness is they create these huge shelters, in New York City, where it's an entire high rise that everybody can fit in. There's a bed. But then they have all these stipulations, and so people don't qualify for them. And so all the beds are empty because the people don't want to go in there because they can't bring their dog, or because they have to be clean, and they can't do that. You can't get clean when you're on the street because there's nobody to support you, and a lot of times you're using just to survive today. You don't have enough food, so you take drugs to get rid of the hunger pangs, or you are traumatized because somebody attacked you on the street and you don't want to think about the fact that you're still vulnerable in that way, or all these different reasons. On the West Coast, we don't have enough beds, and that's just up and down the coast because the weather's nicer. There's not that immediate, oh my gosh, if we don't put this person in a bed, they're going to freeze to death. We don't have that. And so our homelessness problem here, California is now trying to change by demanding that every municipality have enough beds to cover their homeless count every night. And if we don't figure that out, if we don't get it going, then all this is when the lawsuits start. This is why Chico got sued and did their whole thing. But the type of bed and what the stipulations are around that bed matters a lot. The only reason I think that the Good News Rescue Mission is full every day is because there is nowhere else to go. But if there were other places to go and there were more beds available, I don't think that they would be full, because there are so many requirements to that. And they're entitled to do that. They don't have to be everything to everyone. They shouldn't be everything to everyone. There needs to be a place for people who are clean, who don't have an animal, who are willing to, participate in the types of programming that they have there. That place needs to be there for them, but there need to be other places too for the other types of people.
I'm assuming like the micro shelter communities will have stipulations too, right?
Some, but not the same
Very
types.
few.
Yeah.
Not the same.
Yeah. The requirement of the micro shelter, all of them in Reading, is that they be housing first. And the housing first is just the title for you can't disallow someone because they're on drugs or on alcohol.
So they wouldn't have to be clean.
No.
They could still have addictions and everything.
Yes. And ideally part of their recovery program, because one of the stipulations is that they work with a case manager to, work on their issues to get moving out to their next place. That is a requirement. And so hopefully one of those will be, even if it's not immediately, eventually it would be to get clean and sober. But if they're not at the beginning, that can't be a reason to not include them.
How many micro shelters are there in Reading?
Right now there's one.
Oh.
When we open ours, there will be two.
Singular.
Yes.
Oh, so, okay.
But it's something, it's a start, and hopefully it will continue
Well, that's
to
part
grow.
of the providing beds, right?
Yes.
And when people see that this is here and it can work and it will work, that will be our challenge to other churches and other organizations, that they can do it. It's not necessarily easy, but it's important to do. It's worth doing. Okay, sometimes it's just as simple as a fear of change. Marty Mosley called this his small town theory. Reading feels like a small town. People know each other. And so in some way, we have a vested interest in keeping this place a small town, in keeping that small town feel. And so there is an aversion to growing resources, to adding to the footprint of Reading, because then we'll start to lose our small town. And that feeds into not only in terms of services, but in terms of the economy. There are startups down in the Bay Area that have tried moving up here. And they come up here and they bring Bay Area money and they bring it into the city of Reading, which economically for Reading is a good deal. We want money to be coming into the city of Reading, because that money being here will then eventually benefit all of us, including these organizations. But many of them leave because they don't find Reading to be a hospitable place for their startup. And that may be because they find that they are a further distance away. But sometimes they find it's because Reading's a small town, and we want to be a small town. And so even if their startup is something that Reading hasn't experienced before, they end up moving back, even though their money will go further here. They end up moving back, and it keeps us a small town. And that's that cycle that we are going to have to work to break, that we can't seem to break. And some of that just comes from the fear of change. If you've been here for a long time and the city is changing, in one sense, of course it is. Every city is changing, always changing. My previous bishop back in central Pennsylvania liked to say that there are 4 things you can do about the future. You can ignore the future, you can oppose the future, you can complain about the future, or you can lean into it. Because whether we like it or not, we are always moving into the future. And so only one of these is a really constructive way to live. Only one of these is a truly Christian way to live, because we believe that we're moving into a future with a purpose. The future is where God is. And God is going to drag us kicking and screaming into the future. Whether we embrace it or not, that's where we're headed. And so that fear of change is something that is strong in the county, and often even unspoken. And so it manifests itself in anger. It manifests itself in withdrawing into ourselves, that atomization of community. And so at the center of so much that I learned this summer is about fear. I realize that's not an upbeat, it's not an upbeat discussion, but I think that's a good place. Paradoxically, here's another paradox. I think that talking about fear is an important thing for us to do, because that's part of the reason I think we're here as a church community. We're here to address that. We're here to speak to that. We're here to acknowledge that people have fears. And fear is not in itself a negative emotion. It's what we do with it or don't do with it that is positive or negative. And so I think this actually, this discussion, and especially embracing that fear of change, because a lot of times the opposition that I see happening in the community is conflicting visions, very often based on fear? What will happen if? And so that is a place where the church should be. The church should be in a place where we can acknowledge what's happening, but we can say, we know where the future is leading us. We've heard about the kingdom of God, about the reign of God. We know what that vision looks like, and we can help to show people in words and in actions about that vision, and help to encourage in our community that vision. So I'm going to close. Oh, it's right after 12. I'm sorry. I'll close quickly. So this is Deuteronomy 26. This is part of the meditation on the 10th commandment on covetousness, and it is part of a passage that includes offerings, tithes, so on, but it falls broadly under the rubric of not coveting, not desiring for yourself, but being able to let go, which is to say, not just let go of stuff that you have, but let go of situations that worry you, that bring fear and anxiety, and to release them into God's keeping. So this is part of a tithing statement. You are supposed to, according to this passage, when you go to the temple and you bring your offering, this is part of what you're supposed to say. When the Egyptians treated us harshly and afflicted us by imposing hard labor on us, we cried to the Lord, the God of our ancestors. The Lord heard our voice and saw our affliction, our toil, and our oppression. The Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with a terrifying display of power and with signs and wonders. And he brought us into this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. So now I bring the first of the fruit of the ground that you, O Lord, have given me. When I chose this, I thought, he brought us into this place and gave us this land. He gave us this place to stand in the world. And so we all have brought our full selves, our sorrows and our joys, our struggles, our celebrations. We've brought everything of who we are, and we acknowledge that God has brought us this far along the way, sometimes doing things that we never would have thought possible. And now he's brought us here to this part of Shasta County, to California in 2023. And now we can say, Lord, you have done this for us. And now what can we offer back to you? Because when we offer to the community, that's who we're offering to. Sorry, that's my sermon. You got to hear a bonus sermon today. Any questions, comments, insults, recipes, anything? All right, thank you very much. I'm sorry I talked so long. Next week we'll have a forum on El Salvador, the history of the country, very briefly, the history of the Lutheran Church in general, the history of New Hope, Iglesia Nueva Esperanza, and then we'll start to talk about the possibility, if you are so inclined, of going on a trip there in November of 2024. So hopefully I'll see you next Sunday. Blessings on the rest of your week.
Thank you.